Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking with the designer, filmmaker, futurist, and educator Anab Jain. Anab is the co-founder and director of Superflux, a London-based design studio and lab that mixes client work with self-initiated speculative design projects. She also teaches at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna and has delivered a TED Talk last year on design's role in imagining new futures. I was really interested in this kind of way of thinking and really interested in Superflux's work and this blend of client and speculative projects, and was curious to hear from Anab about how these two sides fit together. So we talk about that quite a bit. We also talk about her background in filmmaking and how that influences how she thinks about design. We talk about the role of teaching in her work and design's increasing currency in the world and the disciplinary divisions that we sometimes push up against that come with that kind of increase in currency. Anab hit on so many of the things that have been on my mind the last few months, and it was so fun to pick her brain and hear about how she thinks about all of these things. I found this interview incredibly helpful to me and just in my own work and my own practice. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. These memberships help keep the podcast going and help support the cost of running this podcast. And I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Anab Jain. About you and your work and preparing for this conversation, and I actually thought a really good place to start is to just get right into Superflux and what that is, because it seems from the outside it seems like a really kind of interesting studio model where it's kind of blending kind of traditional like kind of consulting or kind of studio design work, but is also I don't know, kind of like a lab or kind of self-initiated projects also. And so I thought, let's just start there. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about Superflux and what that is and the type of work that you do there.
So John Arden and I co-founded Superflux almost 8 to 9 years ago. It's kind of a blur, but I think over the years, what we have done is have a practice that constantly pushes us to explore what we think of as design or perhaps even art in new ways. We have a model where we know we need to make a living out of this practice. So there is a consulting side to our practice that is about doing commissions or working with clients across sectors, sometimes from public institutions or cultural institutions, or occasionally, very occasionally, corporates. And then we have a sort of a practice that is often self-initiated, that we have an idea and an interest or a technology we are exploring, and we try and find some kind of grant or funding or commission that would help us realize that research and idea. So that's been pretty much our model for the last few years. We used to have our kind of client-facing work was quite different from our kind of research and self-initiated work, but we've actively tried to get them to come closer and closer together so that it's actually just one set of projects and interests that we pursue.
You completely set up my next question, because that's what I was kind of really interested in, because the work of yours that I know, I believe, is all the kind of more self-initiated work. And I was curious, I guess this is kind of two questions. I'm curious what that client or consultancy work, like what form that takes or what that looks like. And
Yeah.
I don't mean visually what it looks like, but kind of, the how that process evolves. And then
Yeah.
part B of the question, I guess, is how do those fit together, the client side work and these kind of self-initiated grant funded work? How do you see those as, how are they starting to come together?
Yeah, good question. It's just today we were revisiting our lose mission statement.
Yeah.
And we really, really are at this point where I suppose the deeper you get into a practice and a kind of rigor around the practice, you start asking more and more questions about the purpose of your practice,
Yeah.
to what end. And so it's actually a kind of, the more interesting it appears from outside, the more confused we actually are.
Yep. I know exactly what you're
That is
talking about.
the reality. So we are in many ways clear but confused. I think the clarity is that merger of commissions and the self-initiated work, as I mentioned. So our kind of interest with all our projects is that it must have some kind of um, impact or an outcome in either the way people think about things or the decisions they make or the strategy they implement or the provocations that then feed into strategies. So there must be something that pushes new ways of thinking, that pushes people to think about futures in alternate and different ways, and also hopefully creates paths for action. So recent kind of client projects that we've done, we did a project with Mozilla Foundation last year looking at voice activated devices, artificial using AI. So you already have a lot of these AI devices in the market. You have got Siri and you've got Echo and all that. But we created 3 different type of devices to get the foundation and their voice AI team to rethink the kind of interactions we might have with machines, to rethink how we trust them, how we trust them to even take decisions and carry out actions on our behalf. So that project became a series of films and objects, and that could well have been a self-initiated project, but
Right.
it was not. So in that sense, it's quite satisfying to see a client approach us for the work we want to do.
And I mean, I don't want to go like too into to how your
Yeah,
business
yeah.
functions, but do clients see these self-initiated kind of projects or these grant-funded projects, and is that kind of how they're discovering you, and are they then coming to you with that in mind, knowing that's the type of work that you do? You know what I mean?
Yeah, 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 definitely. I think as we are finding increasingly that there are certain, so the organizations are made of people and there are all kinds of people in different organizations, and we find that there are actually some really forward thinking people who want to take risks within organizations, who actually become champions of the kind of work we do and try and find ways to bring us in, which is what has happened in the recent past. So we worked on a project with 3 not-for-profit organizations, Bond, Nesta, and UNDP.
Okay.
And 3 people from those organizations really knew that they wanted to provoke and actually get the organizations to transition from being bureaucratic and highly responsive to being more nimble, more agile, and more proactive in how they do international development work. And so we worked with them to kind of help them think through these challenges, and obviously created something very visceral and experiential, because that's what we enjoy doing, and
Right.
that's where our sort of skills lie. So yes, so recent projects have been very much, at least the themes and the concerns that people come to us are things that we are also concerned about and want to address.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of kind of the concerns that you want to address, and speaking of the skills that you have, how did this? I want to go back in time. How did you get into this? Is your background in design?
Yeah, I mean, before design, I actually studied filmmaking,
Oh,
and I mean, I
okay.
studied in a design school in India for the National Institute of Design. And I kind of did this. It's a Bauhaus style school, so you do a foundation. Then I did a bit of communication design, and then I majored in filmmaking. And I was all set to become a film director.
Oh, interesting.
And I was doing like 16 and 35 documentaries, and like it was a real struggle to kind of to be an independent filmmaker in India, where there's a real push to what's very kind of mediocre but populist television, or you are kind of being a third level assistant director to Bollywood directors. And I didn't really want to go down any of those routes.
Right.
So I pursued independent filmmaking for a bit, and then went to the RCA in London to do what was then called interaction design.
Okay. And how much, this might be a weird question, but I'm interested in that transition, or maybe transition isn't the right word, but that kind of shift from filmmaking to interaction design. How aware, like how familiar were you with what interaction design was, or with what even kind of design was? I know you said you went to a design school, but what was that a stark transition, or what did that look like for you?
Not that stark a transition. I mean, when I was in my second year, we had a big Apple computers, donated a lot of computers to our design school, and I had a professor who inspired me and a couple of other friends to apply for this Apple design competition. So yeah, very corporate, but also as a young student, exciting to go to Cupertino and present our ideas. And we had this kind of handheld device that you could use with a stylus pen, and had big icons, and it would tessellate and form this big screen. And so we had all these ideas that we presented there. So I already kind of, that professor, he played a big role in kind of bringing this kind of tech and sort of human-centered design thinking into my life. But I didn't kind of fully get into it. I got into filmmaking, obviously, but I think that was there. And then obviously I looked at a lot of portfolios, although ironically I was going to apply for communication design at the RCA, and I think a day before I quickly changed my application and went for interaction design.
Oh, interesting.
Because I panicked and went, oh no, this is not this. And actually, I think probably the best decision I made.
Can you? This is so interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that kind of crisis, as somebody who, I'm asking this as somebody whose BFA is in communication design, and I want to kind of hopefully connect this to something you said earlier about how Superflux is kind of pushing up against the limits of design, or what those edges could be. And I feel like that's so much of what my career has become, is kind of trying to find those limits or push up against those. What was it about communication design that you kind of were like, oh no, maybe this isn't interaction design is the thing?
Right. So I think I had a little computer in India, and at that point it wasn't like interaction design wasn't a thing, and communication design, I could go and see that they were using filmmaking, and they were doing graphic design, and they were making animation films. So it was familiar. It was all the disciplines that I was familiar with. Interaction design, I wasn't. But what I was seeing in the portfolios of the students was kind of deep provocations. I was seeing real playful kind of explorations, a sort of strange agency that the designers had, that somehow was not discipline dependent, but more around ideas and collaborations, because people came from all different disciplines. So I think that was already at the back of my mind. And then I can't remember the exact moment, but I kind of thought, okay, this is familiar, but this is more interesting. So do I play safe, or do I go for something that's more risky? And I kind of, I was 22 and just,
right.
I went for the risky thing.
Well, the reason that I ask that is, and it comes back to what you were saying about kind of pushing up against those limits of design, is what strikes me about Superflux, and what's so interesting to me about it is that when you look at the work section of your website, it has everything from And even just the work that you've talked about in this conversation has everything from short films to what I would call, more kind of traditional communication design projects, to things that maybe border art, to things like workshops and essays and pieces of writing and speaking.
What you mean is we are basically confused.
Right. Well, no. I mean, maybe that's what it is. I mean, but I'm so drawn to that type of practice that kind of moves between disciplines like that. And it sounds like when you were even in school, you were attracted to that, or that was something that was interesting to you. And I'm curious, were you aware, I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is, were you aware of that even when you were in school, that was something you were interested in? Or was that a kind of conscious career decision, to be able to dabble or to move between all of these different things?
No, absolutely not. I think it was more of a moment of frustration because I was so entrenched in filmmaking. We used to watch world cinema every day. We were sat through like Bresson and Godard and Tarkovsky and Korean and Iranian films. I was really entrenched in the discipline of filmmaking. But it was a real struggle, even though in a short period of time, to really make the kind of films you saw as a student or even aspire to. And I think it was in that moment of frustration that I think I chose something different, just as a kind of opportunity to explore something different I don't think I ever had a really planned, defined career trajectory, to be honest. I had made some brash decisions in my personal life. I was now making seemingly brash decisions in my professional life. And I think it was only maybe when I graduated, even when I had a lot of self-doubt all through university at the Royal College. Even a couple of months before the degree show, I had called up my parents and told them not to come for the degree show all the way from India, even though they had booked flights, but it was going to be terrible. And if you ask my professors, they would express similar. So I had real moments of doubt. And I think it is only later it's only very much later that I start to kind of have started to feel a little bit more settled in. But I also think that living with that kind of sense, a little bit of sense of doubt and a sense of not knowing, can be really helpful in questioning status quo, in questioning very tight, rigid disciplinary boundaries, in pushing yourself to kind of explore things you wouldn't otherwise. I think it actually, in retrospect, has been helpful.
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is completely resonating with me, and even just kind of with things I've been thinking about in my own work in the last couple of weeks. It's actually kind of really funny how closely you're speaking to my own experience right now, because I studied graphic design in undergrad. I worked as a designer, and it felt graphic design was kind of the only thing I've ever wanted to do, really. And then I started working in it, and it felt so limiting. It felt in the places that I worked before I went to grad school, it felt like I was just kind of decorating. I was just kind of picking some colors and some typefaces and laying things out in an appealing way and calling it a day. And while that was interesting, I felt like I wanted more. There was more to this. Like that wasn't the actual thing that I cared about or was interested in. And so that's why I went to grad school. And then in grad school, I started this podcast. And so in grad school, I studied graphic design again, but then my kind of final project was an audio project that had no visuals. And I started kind of I talked about it in the sense that this word design is much bigger than I thought it was, and can incorporate all of these other things, whether it's a podcast or even, in your case, a film, that can all fall under the word design, I think. And that was my way of kind of reconciling it or talking about it. But now, as someone who just opened up a studio and is trying to blend this type of work with client work, suddenly, that frustration is back where it's like, oh wait, what do I call this thing that I'm doing? How do I, everything you're talking about is I feel like exactly where I am right now. So I don't know if there's a question there other than I know what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a journey, and I'm quite, I there's always reality that that comes in. You need to live,
Right.
you need to move beyond just surviving. You start having a family. I have a
Right.
small child. I don't really have that sense. It's a privilege to have that sense of freedom and chance to explore for a short amount of time. But then a lot of other people, a lot of graduate students have huge loans. There
Right.
isn't that opportunity to explore, and it's that window of exploration is actually shrinking. So I
Right.
think I sense that with recent graduates and with design students, this kind of constant struggle with how do we make sense of things in the world at such a young age, and how can we make big decisions, and
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, it's as an educator, I'm now seeing myself in many young people, but people who are also struggling with debts and loans and family pressures and many other things. So it's not an easy
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. I mean, can we talk about teaching a little bit? Because
Sure.
I also teach a couple classes in both undergraduate and graduate, and I've been all of these questions that we're talking about are questions that I feel like I'm wrestling with in the classroom also, because I want to encourage my students to be experimental, to try different things, to find alternative ways to practice design, or even specifically graphic design, that it doesn't I came up in a graphic design system that was very commercially driven, that you have clients and you are a problem solver that solves problems for your clients visually. And while I think that's good, I'm it, like we were saying, I kind of want to open up those borders to my students, with the realization that there are also very real constraints
Mm.
in that.
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
curious how you do you see that kind of tension, or how do you balance that in kind of encouraging this kind of inquiry, but also being realistic about it?
Yeah, yeah. No, I definitely see it. I mean, I think my students in Austria are very fortunate because they have no tuition fees.
Oh wow.
Which is, to be honest, it means that they still have to work on weekends, and they all, they're students, and they still need money to live, but they don't have the pressure of the loans. And in turn, the tutors don't have pressure of students having loans. So there is a freedom to explore that I've sensed is a little bit less in some of the American design schools, where students really are under the pressure to get jobs as soon as they graduate, which means the student portfolio should have projects that would appeal to potential employers.
Right.
And that already starts creating very awkward constraints on the kind of direction that the students want to take in terms of exploration. So I think the constant struggle is to kind of balance with, and especially undergraduate education, balance the kind of potential for exploration with the kind of skills that would allow them to get the jobs, but they have been that the spark has been lit for pushing boundaries or questioning or critical questioning and all of that. So that's the kind of balancing act that I do with my students.
And how do you, something I've been thinking about a lot, and I feel there was some of that in what you were just saying, is that design, not only can design house kind of all of these things, but it's also let me think the best way to say this. I feel like it has a bigger currency in the world now than it does. People know
Yeah.
what that word design means, even if on a somewhat superficial level, it's kind of almost a buzzword in some in some sense.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, has that changed how you think, either how you think about your own work, or even how you work with students, in that design is now this thing that people want, and even in like your more kind of speculative work, that idea of speculative design is even a thing that companies are looking for now.
Yeah, it's very strange actually.
Yeah,
That
it
phenomenon.
is.
Because we've always been really shy of calling ourselves that, because sometimes our work is actually really practical. Like we are designing an air pollution sensing kit that is very practical and will be used by people. There's nothing speculative about it. I mean, in general, I think it's great that different kinds of the word design is branching out into so many different things, and there's an opportunity for people with different interests to kind of explore those trajectories in new and interesting ways. But I think the tension comes when designers get quite territorial about those disciplines.
Right.
That I find, because to be honest, till date, nobody has come to us and hired us because they wanted speculative designers. So nobody comes to us and says, you guys are speculative designers or you are critical designers. Yes, we want to work with you. They come to us either because they've seen a project, or because they want to affect change in a particular way, or they want to communicate a message, or they want us to explore certain technology. So yeah, we have seen that you guys think about technology in interesting ways. We've seen you can prototype, we see you can make interesting things, you can tell a powerful story, you can help us with features, you can help us with our strategy. So people, at the end of the day, what we find is that this term outside of the design discipline has been used, like design thinking, and everybody's talking about design thinking. And what is that? Like, does that mean the designers didn't think before that term?
Yeah.
So I am because I think it's really important to define the discipline, because I think that helps all of us, all of the practitioners agree upon certain things and push the agenda and push the rigor of the practice. But I think it can also come in the way of actually pushing the practice, because you kind of go, no, this is it, and this is not interaction design, and this is interaction design, but this is art. And I agree that yes, it's problematic, but I think it's chewy in its problematicness, because it means that you can take and borrow and collaborate with disciplines, and you can produce something that's compelling and meaningful without falling into the trap of, oh no, we can't do this because this is not interaction design.
Yeah, yes, I agree with everything you said. I have like 5 different things going through my head right now that I want to try to. I think you're exactly right, and it's reminded me. I recently talked to the design theorist Cameron Tonkinwise. Do you know him?
Yeah.
He wrote this great essay a couple years ago called It was called Just Design, and there's a line in there that I assign this essay to all of my students, and I think about this essay all the time, and you were kind of just articulating it, where he basically says any design that is not speculative, fictional, critical, and he goes through all these things, is inadequate designing. And he kind of goes on to say that all design thinking is speculative in some sense, starts as a fiction, should have some sort of critical, that's kind of part of the mandate of the designer. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about when you're talking about these kind of borders and these territories, and especially things like critical design, that then there is some design that is not critical, or design thinking, that there's some type of design that is not thinking or is not thoughtful. And that's something that I'm really interested in, and I kind of agree with you. And I feel like often these words, as they start to gain currency, they also start to lose some of their meaning, or to the part that gets copied, or the part that starts to move is a more superficial version of the thing. And so design thinking, which you brought up, comes up on the podcast a lot as a kind of thing that started as kind of systemizing the design process, or kind of using design process to get to kind of non-traditional ways, and has sort of devolved into Post-it notes and kind of this like creativity thing. And I guess the question, what I'm kind of struggling to get to is, do you have thoughts on kind of that process, or these terms that can be helpful, whether it's speculative design or critical design or design thinking or whatever, that they also are starting to kind of lose their meaning or become visual tropes in a way, like especially critical design and graphic design has started to kind of gain a certain aesthetic, and that if you just make something that looks a certain way, you can call it critical, even if there's kind of nothing behind it. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, for us as practitioners, I think these are useful in terms of how we approach a project. So I think for us, I think it gets problematic when speculative design becomes a toolkit and a process that is packaged and sold as a process. And this cookie cutter method, because that's one thing that, if there's one thing that we have learned in our practice, is that there isn't a cookie cutter method for this kind of practice, and that there isn't one specific toolkit that you can just apply to any brief or any theme or any concern and whip out solutions, because things are complex. When you start asking questions, lots of more things get unpacked, and you might find that we are applying processes from futures techniques and foresight techniques and interaction design and ethnography and anthropology and social science. All of those things are available in our toolkits to use and apply and explore. So I kind of find that one package doesn't work. In terms of critical design, I think of it more as the critical lens with which you practice, and the critical lens you apply to a project when you are exploring the theme or the concern, when you are raising questions, the critical questions you raise, the critical lens through which you think about it is hugely powerful in the direction the project goes. So that's my own personal interpretation of how I want to apply that term.
You mentioned that when a client comes to you, they don't say, we want speculative design or we want critical design. Do they have a deliverable or a product? I don't mean for this question to be so reductive, but do they know, does a client know what they want when they come to you, or what's that kind of process look like?
I mean, quite often they do, and then quite quickly that changes.
Yeah.
Which is part of any design project, not specifically ours, but quite often the designers end up rewriting the brief. Quite often people have come to us because they've seen an experience or an installation that we did and saying, oh, we really loved that, and we thought it was very powerful, blah, and or we would like you to create, in this instance with these three NGOs, a fictional international development organization to show people how things could be different. Or we would like you to explore this technology. So people come to us with very specific kind of briefs, because that's what they've got funding from internally.
Right.
So these things are not divorced from how an organization is thinking and working at that time. And, somebody has decided something's come up and they must think about this differently, or there's competition, or there's an event, or there's, there are things that happen, or that there are some people within the organization who are actually on the path to thinking ahead and long term and want to invest in that. So I think things are so connected that, but by and large, it's always been because of those connected things that people come to us, not just a desire. And yes, maybe there's a desire to explore speculative design, but that hasn't been the only reason, I'd say.
Right. And then so sometimes, they'll come to you with a question or a thing that they're working on, and through your process you're like, this is a film, or this is a website, or this is a whatever. Yeah. Kind of emerges.
Very much so. I think the outcome actually really often emerges at the end. I mean, we have had instances where people have come to us and they want to film because they know that that's going to be the piece that fits into their scheme of things. But quite often we prefer people to not come with the deliverable straight away, and we prefer that they discover not just but a set of deliverables or actionable things or outcomes that could be far more rewarding and surprising than if they had stuck to the original outcome.
Yeah, I love that. Has your film, do you think your background in film has affected, I'm always interested, the reason I'm asking this is I'm always interested in people who come from other backgrounds and into design, probably because that's something that I don't have. Do you think studying film and immersing yourself in that world has maybe affected how you approach design or how you think about design or your process? Has any of that education seeped into your work now?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really interesting because I think I've only acknowledged that recently because for a long while we weren't making that many films and I was almost pushing against that previous life of mine because now I'm on a different journey and now I should do more programming and coding and use electronics and make objects and do everything that is sort of seems to be the thing that this discipline is all about. And only in the last few years, I've acknowledged the fact that no, some of my strengths and interests are in filmmaking. And John, who I work very closely with, so all of the work we do is really a total joint effort. John comes from fine art background as well.
Oh,
he did sculpture. And so he's the one who really enjoys the tangible making aspects of it, while I really enjoy the kind of the narrative and the more fictional and the more sort of filmic aspects of our work. And so I suppose there is a happy marriage there in the kind of projects that come out.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize. I actually think that kind of split in interest and split in skill, in a weird way, kind of explains so much of the questions that I've been asking. I wish we got to that part earlier.
Yeah, me too. I mean, in a way, like I said, it's never been one, for a recent project, John built all these with colleagues in the studio who were also product designers and makers, these kind of food computers that, I would have completely struggled to build, but I could envision them, I could explore the various aspects of them, I could imagine a world where we lived with them, I could imagine the experience of visitors who saw them, and so it's a real collaborative joint effort, and I think there are pros and cons of it, but I think John has pushed me to think more filmically because that's my background and because I enjoy that, and he thoroughly enjoys the hands-on and the technological exploration of things.
Yeah, I love that. I have just a couple quick questions just to wrap it up. These are questions that I ask everybody. This podcast kind of started with an interest in design criticism and specifically kind of how we talk about design or kind of what are the kind of components of the contemporary design discourse. And I'm curious, I'm going to ask you this in two ways. What are the kind of subjects or topics that you've been thinking about lately in your own work? And then kind of secondarily, are there topics or subjects that you think that are kind of important and are kind of pressing designers today that they should be thinking about?
Wow.
Yeah, I saved the hard questions for the end.
I think there are quite a few different things we're thinking about at the minute. One really meaty and very difficult project we're working on is exploring the current phenomenon, if you like, around culture wars, identity politics, nonlinear information warfare, and we are basically looking at this phenomenon of ideological entrenchment leading to conflict and how algorithmically mediated networks are kind of proliferating that sense of entrenchment. And we are exploring what a sort of perhaps even a post-narrative world might look like.
Oh, interesting.
Or we are trying to explore sort of utopic politics, of future utopic politics, because there's such a lot of dystopia around at the minute. Mm-hmm. So that's just that kind of quite, like I said, very meaty. and very difficult to get a head around because it's very conceptual and it's so intangible. In terms of what designers should be thinking about, I think this is something that I'm thinking about a lot in terms of what does meaningful change look like for me as a designer? How can how can I play a role in creating meaningful change in a very specific way in the work I do, or change the nature of my work? And I think designers kind of have a responsibility and commitment to understanding the effect and the sort of consequences of their work. And I feel that if more designers kind of question the work they do or placed it within a larger context, I think that would really help the discipline.
Yes. Yeah. I agree with that 100%. We are speaking the same language, same language there. That's part of kind of what I hope, these conversations and this podcast is kind of one of the goals, is to try to encourage more of that. My last question, and again, this is a question that I ask everybody. If someone's listening to this and was kind of really drawn to the type of work that you do and the things we've been talking about, are there any books or authors or writers or designers who have kind of influenced you that you would give someone as a reading list of, if these subjects interest you, you have to read this person or this book?
Gosh, I'm reading so many. I've been reading so many different, really diverse things. So it's hard to kind of one consistent list. But so I've been reading people like Keller Esterling.
Oh yeah, I just interviewed her.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, I love her so much.
So she writes in a very difficult way, and it's quite hard to penetrate, but some really key concepts around, she compares design in a way to the game of pool, and how you're constantly opening up options and, as an instrument. And, these are all really, really fascinating ways of thinking about design. I have read like anthropologists, like obviously Anab Jain, who writes beautifully. Like, what I love about a lot of anthropologists is how they think about material culture in such poetic and powerful ways, bringing us really upfront and close with the kind of material realities, life around us, that we're so kind of far removed from often. I obviously James C. Scott is a huge influence. Seeing Like a State, To Chase by Anarchism, which I read recently. I'm recently reading a book by Simone de Beauvoir called The Ethics of Ambiguity, which is, again, really hard, but I really enjoy it. So this is kind of I'm just picking a few here.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a great list and a great way to kind of sum up all of this. This conversation was so fun and so interesting to me. I'm a big fan of your work, and kind of just even just kind of talking to you, the way you think about these things. I'm just a big fan of. I just really, really enjoy and admire. And so thank you so much for your time and for this conversation. This was so fun for me.
Likewise, thank you. I kind of these conversations help us reflect about our practice in ways that we don't otherwise get the time to. So thank you for inviting me.
Good, then I've done my job too.
Definitely.
This episode was recorded on June 19th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.